ACE Podcast.
Hi, this is Adam from Misguided Consultation. You are listening to Vaguely Accurate on the ACE Podcast Network.
Hello everyone and welcome to Vaguely Accurate. It's time to get a little bit sciencey. I'm your host DK, and today on the show we'll be discussing topics of fire ecology, sciart, and discover possibly the cutest animal alive is the quokka. This comes from our conversation with Hannah Etchells, a PhD student from the University of Western Australia. I will let her do her own introductions. However, I would like to do a few announcements. We have a few new shows for ACE Podcast Network. Two that I'd like to give a shout out for are Not Alone and Confession Radio. They are really good, enjoyable shows. You should check them out and see if you can support them in any way. I would also like to announce that Season 1 of Vaguely Accurate is wrapping up. It's been a great season. This isn't the last episode. We have a few more in line. But I just want to give you a heads up of what's coming. So Season 2, we're going to be changing the format a little bit. We're going to keep the strict accuracy of Vaguely Accurate that you love, and we'll be meeting people. That is what we do. However, our new series, we're going to be discussing research centres and problems. So each series, Vaguely Accurate, will address a real-world problem which is under current investigation by cutting-edge institutions and research centres. Throughout the series, we'll be meeting students, specialist researchers, and science communicators to deliver you a story of science with tangible applications. By providing a narrative, we hope to provide context of a scientific endeavour many may not understand at first glance. This is a new direction for us, and I'm very, very excited. Once we've got it confirmed, I will be announcing our first research centre to discover, and I hope you share this show and get everyone as hyped up as I am working on it with the team behind. So if you enjoy Vaguely Accurate, please jump on iTunes, rate and review us. It really does help, and it helps us to get that extra little bit of coverage so others may discover us. But I won't delay you anymore. Thank you very much, and let's check it out.
So my name is Hannah. I am a fire ecologist. I did my undergraduate degree in botany and conservation biology, and I got really interested in ecology, which is the study of entire ecosystems as opposed to just specific species. My focus area is the Karri Forest down in the southwest of WA. So it's a part of WA that gets the highest rainfall, and the trees grow up to 90 metres tall. So it's a really beautiful place to work. I'm very lucky. I think I have the best field sites, although I think a lot of people think that about their sites as well. So I moved into fire ecology because it's a really important issue in the Karri Forest and something that actually hasn't been studied as much as I sort of had thought it would have done. So, yeah.
Yeah, like when you said you were a fire ecologist, apart from just having the most badass sounding title.
Yeah, it's cool.
I wasn't too sure on what it involved. And when I finally found out, I was surprised, as you are, that there is not as much research for something that Australia itself puts so much stress on.
Yep.
But for the audience, do you mind defining what fire ecology is?
So fire ecology is the study of an ecosystem's response or a species' response to fire. And my research is looking at the plant and fungal communities in the Karri Forest. So I could also look at a variety of other things. So there are people that have done similar studies in the Karri Forest looking at just birds in the canopy. Yeah. But up until I did my honours project last year, no one had looked at fire severity in the same way I did, mostly because we hadn't had a Karri Forest fire as severe as the one that occurred in Northcliffe in 2015. So that's the fire that I studied. It was a wildfire that burnt nearly 100,000 hectares.
That was the big one, right?
Yeah.
Where you drive past now and you can
still
ruins.
Yeah, exactly. And those are my field sites. Those ruins, I suppose. You can't see the air quotes in the podcast, but yeah. So it was an opportunity to study something that's not been able to be studied before, just because we haven't, since European invasion, we haven't seen a fire of this severity in the Karri Forest. Mm-hmm. So I basically went in and got to figure out how the plant communities are responding so how they're regenerating across a gradient of fire severity. So from sites that were unburnt, low, medium, and high severity.
Okay, so obviously you've just said that this was quite a unique scenario to happen. Not a good scenario for many other people, but then again, I'm sure ecologically it's got its benefits.
Yeah, so the socio-political issues surrounding fire and fire management in Australia and in Western Australia as well are very complex. And luckily, the Northcliffe fire, despite burning 98,000 hectares, didn't actually cause a single human fatality, which is incredible. And it's just a reflection of the fact that that area is quite sparsely populated. They managed to save the entire town of Northcliffe. And obviously there was damage, and there were farms that were really badly burnt, and sheds and homes and cars and a lot of cattle, not to mention obviously all of the bush and Karri Forest, Jarrah Forest, and all the animals there, including one of the largest mainland population of quokkas. Oh. So, yeah, most people think quokkas are only found on Rottnest, but actually there are a few in the Jarrah Forest, and quite a large population did exist in the Karri Forest where the fire happened. So there are currently people monitoring those populations to see how the quokkas are recovering as well.
For anyone that doesn't know, a quokka is it's a marsupial, am I correct in saying that? And they stand about 30 centimetres tall, and they kind of look like rats, but incredibly cute. Rats and a bunny put together, I think, is the best way to describe it. Yeah.
So the island that is named for them is called Rottnest, and it actually means rat's nest, because when European people first found it, they thought they were giant rats. But they've actually also been voted, I think, the world's happiest animal.
Yeah.
And if you look up the hashtag quokka selfie, that's definitely a thing.
So they've got no natural predators over there, so they're quite...
Apart from the snakes,
Apart from the snakes.
Yeah, and levers or schoolies. I don't know.
And people.
Yeah, unfortunately.
People.
Yeah, so the mainland populations are threatened by foxes and cats and wild dogs. So those have been restricted to quite small populations, such as the one in the Karri Forest, which is cool.
Before I ask you a bit more about your research yourself, could you, if you can, as simply as possible, give us an overview of what is the ecology of, fire ecology, or the ecosystem that is... fire is imperative to an ecosystem. Could you define that for us?
Yeah, so all across Australia we have vegetation that is adapted to cope with certain frequencies and severities of fire, because it's been a natural part of history here for millennia. So in a lot of parts of the world, such as places in Europe and in the US, the plants haven't evolved as long with fire, so they can actually get killed by it. So if you think of pine trees, conifers in the US, they have a really big problem over there with increasing severity wildfires, kind of probably exacerbated by climate change. So they've got an issue over there, more so in some ways than we do here on an ecological perspective, because their plants aren't as adapted to cope with fire as our plants are. But it also would be naive to say that all of our plants here are really good at surviving fire, because we are finding, up to a point. And they're also, a fire's effect depends on things such as what time of year it burns, how long it burns for, how severely it burns, and also the fire intervals, so how long it's been since the last fire. So our plants can respond to, I suppose, what they're used to, what they've been responding to for a couple of sorry, maybe edit that bit out. So should I just start from the bit before?
Yeah, if you want
that. Cool. So our plants can cope with what they're used to, so what's been happening for the last few millennia. So they can do things, for example, like karri trees, they can resprout from what's called the epicormic buds underneath their really thick bark. So you might have seen, if you've ever driven through a Karri forest or a Jarrah forest after a fire, even 6 months after a fire, it looked like all the trees are wearing woolly green jumpers. Yeah, so what that is that's epicormic resprouting. So they've got these special buds that lie dormant under their bark, and if the entire tree gets burnt and defoliated, or even a part of it gets damaged, and actually even sometimes if they're stressed or get attacked by insects, then this epicormic resprouting happens, and they can grow enough leaves to make the energy they need in order to regrow their canopy. So that's a really awesome little response that they have to cope with fires. So you'll often see that. There are other species in the understory that have to have fire or smoke in order to germinate from seed. So in that way, fire is really useful because it promotes regeneration of certain understory species.
They can use the smoke.
Yeah, so there is a chemical in smoke called carriquinolide. So there's the word carry again.
Yeah.
But it's found in all smoke. Actually, people at Kings Park were the ones that isolated it and discovered what it did. So it's used in a lot of restoration work now to break seed dormancy in seeds that they weren't able to germinate previously. And it's actually now used all around the world because it turns out even, plants in other places in the world respond to this carriquinolide and they can break their dormancy
That's fascinating.
when exposed to it.
I've never even heard of that.
Yeah.
I always assumed I've heard of the trees that germinate or at least need fire to germinate.
Yep.
I always thought that was a physical mechanism induced by the heat.
It is. For some it is
chemical
as well. Yeah, so there's a bit of both. So certain, for example, Banksias, they've got those big cones. So after the flower of a Banksia sort of dies away, they have those cones and that's where the seeds are kept. And they need either a fire or really hot, dry conditions to open up their little seed cases. And so you'll see that they get burnt, they open up their seed cases and their seed then gets dispersed. Now that seed doesn't have to be exposed to smoke to germinate, but it does need a high enough temperature for the seed case to open so the seed can come out.
Yeah. This might come across as a wrong question.
Mm-hmm.
But so you said before that this ecosystem relies on the fire in order to help germinate. Most ecosystems operate in a give and take kind of system. So let's say, a presence of a fire is going to help this area germinate and keep its life cycle going.
Mm-hmm.
With the presence of the plant life and fauna life that's going on, do they influence the condition of a fire? Because you said that the variations of the frequencies and intensities of a fire have an impact on how efficient their germination process are, so vice versa. Can they control, or do they try and control, maybe make the conditions more dry to induce fires?
Yeah, absolutely. And so this is part of the theory behind management, so controlled burns, which is what we practice in Southwest WA. And that's because, you're totally right. So the amount of fuel, if you think of it as fuel, in the understory of a forest, for example, will determine how long that forest will burn for, potentially how intensely it will burn and things like that. So what can often happen, there are certain species that will appear after fire very, very quickly, grow really vigorously and then die off. So then they become basically this really high fuel load sort of thing. That, it doesn't so much happen, well, I've not witnessed it happening so much in the Karri forest, but I know that they have a really big problem with that up in the Pilbara because they've got some invasive grasses there and it's being burnt too frequently. And so then those grasses end up taking over because they're really good at coming in after a fire, but then those grasses are also really flammable, so then another fire happens and it happens more severely. So you get this sort of spiraling effect.
Yeah, so there's like an intermittent. So if you were to look at any kind of life cycle or kind of ecosystem cycle, you've kind of got stages, and you've got this intermittent stage where it's not just like plant life, fire, germination thing. You've got maybe even like plant life, fire induces secondary plant life, which induces hotter fire, which then would induce the germination. So there's kind of this build-up stage. And
that's exactly right with the frequency of burns. So what we do in the southwest of WA to manage fuel loads is actually to prescribe burn. Yeah. So they'll go in, and this does happen in the Karri forest, to reduce fuel loads so that they don't get these sort of catastrophic wildfire events like we saw with Northcliffe. So the theory behind it is that you remove all of this understory leaf litter, because the leaf litter in the Karri forest can go up to 1 metre deep. So that's basically just dry leaves, sort of all rotting leaves, And the understory itself can grow 15 metres tall. So it's quite a densely vegetated understory. So you imagine a fire would carry from, the lowest leaf litter up into the mid-story and then right up to a 80 metre tall karri tree. So they try and reduce the amount of understory fuel load by doing prescribed burns. At the moment, though, there's not actually, like I said before, a lot of research surrounding the required frequency for carry forest. So in order to, promote the germination and resprouting and regeneration and things like that. So we know a little bit more about the jarrah forest, and what's actually happening at the moment is that the carry forest is being burnt on a similar regime to the jarrah forest, but they're quite different systems. So what's really needed, I think, is, there's so many things that need to be studied, but a real look into how frequently we should be burning the carry forest to reduce fuel loads, and whether or not we should be following the same pattern as the jarrah forest, because if you visit the two of them, even to someone who doesn't know anything about plants, like, it's a very different place. There's entirely different species nearly. Like, there'd be a crossover of about, 10 species in some parts of the jarrah and carry forest. They're quite different places.
So you need to make a unique management tool for a different ecosystem. It's a different forest.
Yeah.
It's similar.
Yeah, it's similar in that it's a forest, but it's a lot. The carry forest grows in the wetter parts of the state, so where we get over 1,200 mils of rain a year, whereas jarrah forest can go right up to, I don't know the exact amount, but it grows in the Perth Hills, so that'll be about, 500, 600 mils of rain, Yeah.
So with obviously this unique opportunity being there, that there was just a big fire, and now you've got this environment that you can study. Yep. Are there many others like yourself going into studying this area, or is it just currently that you're aware of?
That I'm aware of. I'm the only one doing vegetation surveys across a gradient of fire severity. Because a lot of the carry forest down there that was burnt is actually regenerated after having been logged, so it's basically used for its timber. The timber industry have gone in and they've done some stuff to see if they can salvage the wood and to see what sort of measures they have to take to basically recoup what they've lost, so whether or not they have to replant the forest that they want to be able to harvest or whatever. So people are studying that, but I'm, as far as I'm aware, the only one studying the old growth, so that is trees over 250 years old, the old growth carry forest and the effects that the North Cliff fire had on it. There is someone down there, like I said before, though, studying the quokka populations. So that's my mate Charlie, who's great.
You got a friend down there already. It's great.
Oh yeah. It's not a big place, so you pretty much you have to be friends with everyone.
So I'd like to move into your project now and what you plan to do. Could you tell us a little? You said you're looking at the way that fungi kind of react to these fire situations. Could you tell us a little bit more about that, and also what fungi are you actually talking about?
Oh well, that's a tricky question. I didn't plan to look at fungi at all when I started my honours. I've never studied fungus before. It's obviously not a plant, and my degree is in botany. I just have a sort of an interest in it because it's really awesome, and obviously because plants depend on it for their, a lot of species can't live without certain fungi species. So I sort of just anecdotally collected the fruiting bodies, so the mushroom bits, I suppose you'd call them, when I was down there doing my field surveys. Not knowing really anything about what species they were or anything like that, knowing that there was a guy who is basically the king of Southwest fungi, Mark Brundrett, at my uni, who could help me out, hopefully, if I spoke nicely to him. Because it wasn't a part of my honours project, I haven't actually done that bit yet because I was focusing on the bit that was actually my project. But there's something, I think, and Mark agrees, quite interesting going on with the fungi following the fire. It seems to be that there are a lot of these sort of what are called fire ephemeral species, so they only come in after a fire. But across my gradient of severity, there appears to be certain species that might look like they favour a low severity burn, and some that look like they might need a really high severity burn in order to come into the site. So,
really...
I wish I knew more about it. It's something that's sort of a bit of a burning question.
Fungi is also always a very weird but unique kind of item. They sit in between. It's always
animals
really
and
odd and
plants.
has unique properties and doesn't seem to respond in any particular way, because people always kind of characterize it as a plant, even though it's not. They kind of assume it has similar characteristics.
I think technically, taxonomically closer to an animal, but
it is. I don't know if you've ever heard of it, but there's this thing called the wood wide web. It's in some forests, I think in South America.
Oh, the mycorrhizal network.
Stuff that goes under the rhizomes, and it's like really kind of fungi-made microfiber tubes almost.
All fungi do that. We have thousands of mycorrhizal species here as well. We don't have as many mycorrhizal species in the southwest of WA as many other places in the world do. And that's because our plants have other strategies to get nutrients. Because what these fungi that you're talking about that make these networks underground and connect to plant roots do is help the plants take up essential nutrients like phosphorus. So in the southwest of WA, we have really low phosphorus soils, some of the lowest phosphorus soils in the world. And so it means our plants have adapted really clever and unique ways to uptake or basically scavenge and get all that those little bits of phosphorus out of the soil that they can. So we have some species that use mycorrhizal fungi to do that as their little symbiotic partner. So basically the fungi gets food from the plant and the plant gets food from the fungi. So they have this little two-way relationship. But we have a lot of species that don't need that mycorrhizal fungi either because they've developed sneaky other ways to get nutrients that are actually even more efficient than mycorrhizal fungi.
Do you happen to know?
Yeah, so the one that probably everyone would know for looking at is a Banksia. We talked about them earlier. So Banksias are in the family Proteaceae, and they have what are called cluster roots or proteoid roots sometimes because they are often found in Proteaceae or in most Proteaceae, I think. And so what those are is that they're basically looks a bit like a bottle brush, but it's on the root underground. And it increases the root surface area so that more nutrients can be exchanged, so they can get this phosphorus out. But what was discovered that they can do that's really clever is they can actually exude carboxylate. So they can exude something that will unlock the phosphorus that's bound to the soil. So none of the other plants that don't have these cluster roots can get that bit of phosphorus, but the Banksia can go in and be like, haha, and it can uptake this phosphorus far more efficiently.
It takes the chemical component it wants that holds the phosphorus.
So it's basically mining the phosphorus from the soil, which is very, very, very cool. So we have...
Very Australian.
Yes, and very specifically very southwest Australian. So there are other species that do that all around Australia and in other parts of the world as well. But we've got a really, really high percentage of our species here compared with most places that do this really clever cluster root thing. That's a neat example of something that's not fungi related, but sort of underground related.
Are you able to give us a bit of an example and tell us what your methodology will be or what you plan to be going into?
Well, it probably would be a bit tricky to talk about my methodology coming up for my PhD project because I'm starting that next week. So I haven't really started looking at the nitty-gritty details of that. But I could talk about my methodology for my honours project that I completed. Yeah. So it was quite a simple study. I wanted to obviously, with an honours project, you've got to get it done in 9 months. So it is quite simple, and it's an ecological study, which means it's quite opportunistic. So we had to select field sites according to a certain criteria. So my criteria for selecting my sites were that they had to be old growth, so with trees around 250 years old. Mm-hmm. They had to have not been burnt that we knew of in the last 50 years. So that was very tricky. But we managed to get there. And they can't have been logged, obviously, which if they're older than 250 years, they wouldn't have been logged. So that we could get comparable sites to each other, because there's no use in comparing an old growth with a recently logged forest, because it's quite a different place. And then I had to find this gradient of fire severity. So I had to find sites that were unburnt. And that's because no one had gone in before the fire to take any measurements because we didn't know the fire was going to happen. So in an ideal world, you'd have pre-fire data on the same sites. Yeah. But obviously with a, opportunistic event like this, we didn't. But we've used very nearby control sites, I suppose you can call them, that have the same underlying substrates of the same soil and are very sort of geographically close by. So thought to be as similar as possible to what our burnt sites were like before the fire. So then I had a gradient of fire severity from unburnt right up to what I called apocalypse, which were these extremely burnt, kind of very scary looking sites. And at each of those sites, I set up a 30 by 30 meter plot. So it's a big square. And I had subplots in those that I sampled soil and all vascular plants from. And I measured all of the carry trees for their diameter. And then in the sites with carry seedlings, I measured their growth rate by looking at their height and their density.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You said that you were looking at different. You gave yourself a select range of parameters to identify sites.
Yes.
So they had to all be of a similar era, I suppose,
Mhm.
or at least exhibit similar characteristics. With that in mind, what is it? Just abundance and diverse species diversity that differentiate a newer and older plot?
Oh, that is a tricky question. Not necessarily. So there are certain species that occur sort of at the beginning, like after a disturbance. So like the ones we were talking about before, they're disturbance specialists.
Yeah.
And then they'll gradually die out. And it's, it's sort of what you learn about in ecological theory with the facilitation species, so species that come in and fix nitrogen into the soil, and then they die away and leave that nitrogen behind, and other plants can come in and use it and grow. And so, yeah, the main difference would be in the understory, to be honest. So if it was, for example, if you're comparing a site that had been logged within the last 20 years, all of the carry trees there are going to be an even age because they'll all have germinated at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
So what normally happens after a logging activity is that seed trees get left behind. So big old trees get left occasionally.
Yeah.
I don't know exactly what the distance apart they have to be effective is. But basically they then drop their seed and then that germinates to regenerate the forest.
Yeah.
And carry trees are quite fast growing, so once they sort of, get started, they can be, you could see like a 20-year-old tree and it could be, 20 meters tall. Yeah, they're really
That's actually
quite quick. 20 meters tall. Yeah, it could be taller than that actually. Sorry, I feel like I'm probably
be really
underselling
annoyed if
it.
one of those seeds just germinated in my garden and you
Yes.
notice it.
Although unless you live somewhere with more than 1,200 mils of rain a year, you might have trouble keeping it alive. They do need lots of water to
Not in
grow.
Perth.
Yes, not in Perth unless you reticulate it. There are a few growing at Kings Park and at uni. We've got a couple, but so the main difference would be, so you'd have the carry there. It would obviously be a different age and it would all be even age, but you'd probably have quite a different understory. So there'd be key understory species that kind of stay there for a really long time, such as Trimalion, which is one of the main key understory species in the carry forest. But then you'd have these ephemeral species that kind of come in and out. So you've got acacias, which fix nitrogen, and certain grass species and stuff like that.
Yeah. Did you find that, something I always like to ask, did you find that there were any limitations from doing research? Whether
Yes.
you find it ethical, there are always limitations, but what did you find?
Not being able to find as many replicates as I wanted because I had these criteria. And you think in 98,000 hectares I'd be able to find at least 4 of each. I couldn't, so I found 4 unburnt, and I could only find 3 of what I call this sort of apocalypse burn. And that's just because that's the way fires burn. They burn heterogeneously. It's not, like a line in the sand and it goes from being severely burnt to not severely burnt.
Yeah.
It's very much a gradient. And because there's been a lot of logging activity in that area, there's a lot of farmland in that area. I forgot to mention one of my other criteria is it had to be pure carry forest, so more than 80% carry trees as the main overstory. So if there was a Maori or a Jarrah that had kind of snuck in there, then I couldn't use that site. And that's my main frustration was that, to be honest. I had a site that we surveyed, and it wasn't until we got back and I looked at the data that I realised that it really wasn't a pure carry forest. It wasn't comparable to any of the others. And so I had to can a few things like that. And I mean, the sort of, I suppose, the exciting / terrifying for Australian parties working in the carry forest isn't the safest place to work, like in terms of our health and safety, Obviously there's things like snakes and things which...
no Australian ever classes as a hazard anymore.
No, I mean, it's a tiger snake, it's fine. We saw a few, they generally get out of your way. But no, falling branches is the main... It is actually a really real threat, so a number of people who work around carry trees, I've actually heard it's more than you'd think, like more than one a year sort of thing, which is quite scary. So they kind of get given the name... sort of colloquially among farmers, widowmakers, because they can just drop branches sort of spontaneously, especially after a dry season or especially after they've been burnt.
Yeah.
So we actually had a bit of a close call once where the wind had picked up quite a lot. So, I mean, if it goes over about 15 knots, then we sort of can our surveys anyway, because if it's windy in the carry forest, it's not a place that you want to be because they'll drop branches, especially if it's been burnt. And so we were like, okay, well, we'll can this site and we'll come back tomorrow and do it again. And we're pretty glad we did, because then we drove back in the next day and the road was actually completely blocked off by about a 70-metre tall tree that had fallen right across about, 30 metres away from where we were planning on surveying. So, yeah, that sort of thing's a bit scary. And it also is frustrating because then you have to travel well, for that one we just jumped over it and took all our stuff with us. But if, the road's blocked off at the beginning of the road you need to get to, 20 k's down, then you've got a long way to go around.
Yeah.
And bridges get, burnt out and stuff like that. So those sorts of things are just logistically frustrating and limited what we could do. It always takes you so much longer than you think it's going to undertake.
Always.
A dismal sort of 12 surveys. Just be like, oh God, it could take you like a week.
You're looking forward to getting into your PhD?
Yes, definitely. I want to get started right away, but I need to plan a lot of stuff first. So
yeah, what made you want to go into further academia rather than going into trying to find a job outside of academia?
Well, I sort of sat down and thought about what my favourite things about science are, and really, I really like designing experiments.
Mm-hmm.
I really like teaching and communicating science, so more so with adults and the general public, less so with kids, which is why I would not be as interested in doing teaching.
Yeah.
But I also really like the idea of running my own lab one day. So
That'd be cool.
yeah, I really like sort of getting to decide what I study, and I like sort of motivating teams of people. So I think that the way to do that is to...
You love being your own manager and
Yeah,
optimal control
yeah.
over what you do and say.
Yeah, and I think
Yeah.
I quite like writing, which is something that a lot of people struggle with in a PhD. I come from an arts background, and so I've always liked language and really liked writing, and I like scientific writing. And I strangely like statistics.
Hey, there's nothing wrong with that.
Yeah, it's an unpopular... I would never would have thought I would be someone who would like statistics. I don't like maths for the sake of maths. I never got it in high school. But when I can apply it to something I'm really interested in asking, then I love it. So, yeah, all of those things made me be like, well, it's kind of a perfect career for me. If there were more jobs in academia, that would be awesome. But maybe things will be different in 3.5 years' time when I finish my PhD.
So you said that you came from an arts background. Did you have a degree in an arts background or just professional experience?
I studied fashion and textile design.
Okay.
And then I worked as a stylist and creative director, and also did a bit of visual merchandising as well as part of that. So yeah, it was quite a different field and sort of like the things you are doing day to day. So everyone sort of always goes, oh, that's so weird. You went from something that sort of seems almost like the opposite, from like fashion into botany. But yeah, I always sort of think that I find that I use the same parts of my brain. So when you have a problem in the design world, you have to be innovative and you have to persevere and you have to work really hard in the face of adversity in order to get over that problem in design and sort of design something useful. And it's exactly the same in science. You have to be innovative, you have to be hardworking, and you have to persevere in the face of constant sort of failure and knockbacks and stuff like that. So it requires at a base level pretty much the exact same skill set. But now instead of, I suppose, prancing about kissing people and drinking champagne, I get to prance about in the Karri forest and collect flowers, which is to be honest, it's more me for sure.
Now, knowing that you do art, I must ask you, do you have any thoughts or opinions on the whole sciart kind of movement, I suppose?
Yeah, I'm very interested in it. I never realised that it was an entire thing unto itself until I started studying science, and then people started asking me that. I get asked that a lot. Because I've sort of always had this cross-disciplinary thing going on. So even when I was doing design, everything I did was actually, now looking back at it, I realise quite inspired by ecology and natural systems and that sort of thing as well. So all of the sort of themes of my work were that. So I think for myself, I've never really seen them as particularly separate. So that people think it's sort of, you know, that this new sort of sciart thing exists, to me seems a bit like, oh yeah, I mean...
To you, it's always existed.
Well, I don't know. It's just two things that I really like, and I've tried to mash them together wherever I can. So even for like assignments in undergrad, I'd always sort of try and make them, you know, look very beautiful. Or
and it helps. In something that I'm more and more appreciating is doing science, being a great researcher is brilliant. Like, it's important for three things. Like, you need knowledge and understanding of your field. You need technical skills and being able to use specialist software and hardware. And then the communication part, and art is a very, very big part of communication. Like, people are visually inclined to look at pretty things.
Yeah,
so
totally.
If you can communicate what you want through a pretty method, and art is very good at capturing people's eyes and imagination, then if you'd be able to merge these two together, then you've got a much better, I suppose, delivery method.
Yeah, I'd really like to explore that more on like a more sort of official level, I suppose. And maybe even, you know, one day actually, I've got a couple of people in the lab that I work with that are sort of interested in that sort of thing as well. So I don't know, maybe one day we'll put on an exhibition, or even something less traditional than that, like some sort of experiential thing, like out in the bush, or I don't know. Like, there's a lot of stuff that would be really cool to do. So,
So before I finish off, I always ask, is there anything you wish to say to the audience? Do you have anything you wish to advocate, or do you have anything you wish to just share? Yeah,
I suppose my main thing that I would love people to take away from this is that there is a whole sort of world out there that we know so much about in some ways and virtually nothing about in a lot of ways. And so if something takes your interest, follow that path down. You know, I never would have thought when I was, you know, in my third year doing fashion and textile design and working out my concept for my final grad collection and going down to the Karri Forest then and sort of being inspired by it and collecting leaves and dyeing things with them and making pin-up boards, you know, full of pictures of plants and creating this character in this world in the forest, that then would essentially become the arts version of what I'm doing now as a scientist. And I think it was just because I grew quite obsessed with this particular ecosystem and I just wanted to keep on finding things out about it. And I realized that while we know some things about it, we don't know a huge amount about it. And so now I can hopefully keep finding things out almost indefinitely. That's what's cool about science, is that everyone always thinks that scientists are there to answer questions, but I like to think that we're just there to make more questions. So you'll answer something, but then that'll lead to like 100 more questions, and that's so exciting.
And that's it for us today. Thank you very much for joining us on Vaguely Accurate. I hope you learned something new. If you have any questions about the show, get in touch with us by any of the social medias. We're all on there. Or you can email us at vaguecomments@gmail.com. Check out our website, see if there's anything on there that interests you. And we just want to hear from you. If you yourself would like to feature on the show, also contact us, see what we can arrange. We do local or we can do Skype, so it all works out. Alright guys, take care, have a good week.
Welcome to Confession Radio, the show where people write in for advice. My name's Piers Ray.
My name is Eric Ivanovich.
My name is Bruce Wozniak.
My name is Lainey Zuckerman.
My name is Dr. Latrice Drain.
My name is Dr. John McGrail.
And my name is David Allen, creator and host of Confession Radio. Here at Confession Radio, we love to help other people. As you heard, some of the awesome elite team that we have that are willing to help you with your problems. Don't forget to visit the website, confessionradio.net. You can hear us on iTunes, Stitcher, anywhere you listen to your podcasts. And also, we are featured on iHeartRadio. So stay tuned, because here comes Confession Radio.
Confession Radio is for entertainment purposes only.